Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the break. I'm Dawn Kalea, the editor of Report on Business magazine. Following on the panel you heard just before we broke, we're going to continue the discussion with one of Canada's most notable entrepreneurs, AJ Virmani. AJ's is a quintessential immigrant success story. He went from washing windows to creating Cargojet from the ashes of Canada 3000. It's now Canada's most awarded cargo line with more than $750 million in revenue this past fiscal. It's a feat that landed him a spot on Report on Business magazine's Strategist of the Year list in 2020. He's also been awarded Entrepreneur of the Year by RBC and Ernst & Young. Mr. Virmani is joining us remotely today. AJ, thanks so much for being here. There you are. Hi. So let's dive right in. You emigrated to Canada in the mid-1970s. What was the climate like for newcomers at the time, particularly in terms of entrepreneurship?
When I arrived in 1975, I remember exactly, it wasn't very favorable climate entrepreneurs at that. Do I graduated at Commerce University, India, the 7th world, but, objective was to get a stable job. Didn't even know what an entrepreneur was. Probably couldn't tell that at that time. It was very, the atmosphere was not getting to a business, but just getting to a stable job, and security was a big issue. But certainly, the thought crossed your mind many times that I want to be my own boss. But it was not a climate that was very welcoming, first of all, of immigrants, and number two, entrepreneurs. People who were established, they were established. People who were in business, they were in business. If you were working, there was no such thing as you could dream at that time. Owning a business or running a business or being your own boss. It was strictly being at that time, making ends meet and, pay your bills. The days where you borrow from Visa to pay MasterCard, MasterCard to pay Visa, and anything in between those and any other jobs you can get.
Right.
So never dreamt of it, never thought of it. The only thought that, always stayed with me was that, I want to be my own boss one day. So that was basically it. But there was no help from any agencies, banks, or atmosphere. As a matter of fact, everybody kind of discouraged you. Even if you had an idea, where are you going to get the money?
Right.
So I think it's a lot different today, but certainly at that time, it was very, very challenging.
Well, eventually you landed at Cottrell. You worked your way up through the ranks there. What did you learn there that made you want to strike out on your own to start Cargojet? Had things changed significantly?
I was at Cottrell. I started at the lowest job in 1976. By 1982, I had moved myself, working hard and somewhat working smart, both. I'd moved myself into senior financial position in charge of budgets and, accounts receivables and various other projects. And I think in 82, I was in a corporate meeting where what changed my life was that I was in a corporate meeting with salespeople and marketing people, and this was my first sort of exposure to a management meeting. And I kind of commented that we should get more dense cargo to get maximum yield out of containers and boxcars. And my analysis showed that we were carrying a lot of light freight, and that wasn't making any money. So when I brought that up, I was told basically, as a bean counter, you should just do your job and not tell us how to sell and market and develop our products.
Right.
That really didn't sit well with me. Who wants to be called a bean counter, to be honest with you, even if you are one? And the reflection was basically to go back and say, what am I going to do different to change that perception? And as a matter of fact, I started literally hating my job I just had that job, and I hated my job, like being called a bean counter, because I said, okay, I'm going to be an accountant for the rest of my life.
Right.
So I said, I have to do something different to change that perception. Nobody's going to do it for me. So let me go get an MBA in international marketing and finance and other sort of good things. M&A was one of my things that I did. And the rest is history. So that 2 years of my MBA in US kind of changed my life. And then I started working for the same company back, but more as a general manager now. I was in charge of the sales and marketing, that I was told that I was a bean counter. So my job was to turn around that company, which I did. And by '89, they had offered me partnership in the organization. And I've always been an individual that I say I don't follow the crowd. And that time, there was one thing going on, which was crowdy thing, was everybody wanted to do a management buyout,
Right.
and let the owners retire. And it was only a $30 million acquisition, but I said, okay, I'll be responsible for $8 million out of it with my percentage. And I didn't want $8 million of the debt, although I know it's not personal, it's all business debt. But then my decision was simply that, look, I built this organization in 4 years. I cleaned it up. I took it from $2 million losses to $10 million profit here. Why am I getting into a mixed bag? Interest rates could go up, management buyouts are in today, but they might be, you would be working for the bank pretty well. You got 5 partners to live with. Why am I getting in such a mess? Why don't I do this for myself? It might be smaller, but it'll be for myself.
Right.
And that was my motivation of getting into the business.
And so what were the biggest challenges you faced when you did strike out on your own?
The biggest challenge you always face is, if you believe in yourself and you know that your idea is solid, there's a market demand for it. Hopefully you develop some relationships that will support you for business. So you have done all your homework, you've done your market analysis. The biggest challenge you always face is money. In those days. Today, I guess the biggest challenge is probably coming up with an idea, right? So money is plenty out there at a very low interest rate. But in those days, interest rates used to be 10, 15, 20%. Who even remembers? But I know you could easily get 8 or 10% on your GIC those days for deposits. So money was always a big challenge in those days. And, for me, I had a couple of friends who invested in my business. They believed in my ideas. Took a mortgage on my house, basically gave my wife a check for $5,000. And I said, I don't know when the next check is going to come, but this is it. So you got to manage for the next 3 to 4 months.
Oh, wow.
So it was very tough because no banks would lend you the money at that time.
Right.
It was a very tough business environment in those days compared to today. So,
right. And what changes do you think we need to see nowadays to help more sort of entrepreneurs get up and running in this country?
Well, ideally, you always see every government has Minister of Small Businesses, Minister of Entrepreneurs. I don't remember the government helping out anybody ever that I know of. So forget that avenue. I'll be very honest with you. If you depended on the government, you would not go anywhere in this life. So what changes are needed? I think as a corporate citizens, like companies like ours, there are many other startup companies who have benefited, especially now look at the pandemic, how some companies have benefited. There's many companies who have, and I don't want to name any because that's not the forum here. But I think to create more entrepreneurs, we need companies like mine to encourage that within our own. If somebody is good at software, how about helping them develop a company? Hey, you work for me, give you an opportunity, and you can develop a couple other companies, and you would always have that person's loyalty. So I think this whole atmosphere has to be developed. Obviously the banking industry plays a big part in it, and I think they are helping more than the government is probably. BDC has some good financial instruments that are available, but I think it has to come from the entrepreneurs to help other entrepreneurs. You can't expect the government to do it. You can't expect the banks to go all the way. But people who were in those shoes are the people who need to step up, whether through associations or whether through meetings or through encourage through business schools. We have to see a concerted effort, which doesn't exist today, that people who were once had a dream and they realized their dream. Mm-hmm. They should put themselves in those people's shoes. Like anybody sends me a business plan, to be honest with you, I always look at that business plan. I always read it. If I could learn something, if I can give them some guidance, I do. And I've even financed a whole bunch of ventures in my life, So I believe that the business has the responsibility because it is good for overall business if we can help other entrepreneurs get it.
And I mean, what do you think is holding corporate Canada back? Is it just sort of our famous risk aversion here in this country? What's it going to take to get that to actually happen?
Corporate Canada is too busy with, a lot of corporate Canada, when they make it, they kind of forget their roots and they forget where they came from. I don't think anything is holding them back. I think the business climate in this country in general is going down the tube. I'll be very honest with you. All you sit with these business people and banks and, accounting firms, all they're busy is in advising people on wealth management and how to sort of pack up and go from here to lower tax places. So there is not a whole lot of focus by the society, by the government in investing in this country. It's more the focus is we got too many problems. We need to. They're advising more people not to invest in this place, which is not right in my mind. It is what it is. We got to make the best out of it. So a lot of people are discouraged by the conversations, the chat lines, the groups. Yeah, I'm packing up. I'm moving to Florida. I'm going here. I'm going there. There's no opportunity here, right? Things are not right. You're paying 57% in taxes, more to come. Even if I made some money on capital gains, now it's going to be 75% tax.
Right.
So the environment around is very negative, unfortunately, for any business entrepreneurs to dream of. And I don't know what will change that, but that's what I read in the past couple of years. That's what's happening.
Well, due to time, we're going to have to leave it there, but I would say that was a fairly rousing call to action from you, sir, and this is exactly why we love to write about you in the magazine, because you are incredibly quotable. So we really appreciate you taking the time to be with us today. So sorry about the technical difficulties off the top, and we'll have to leave it there, and hopefully we'll talk to you again soon. Thank you so much. And now I'm going to...
Thank you so much for inviting me, and anytime I'm here to help any of the people who dream and entrepreneurs, anything I can contribute, I'm always there for it. So thank you so much.
Awesome. That's very generous of you, sir. Thanks so much. And now I'll hand things over to my colleague, Tamar Durrani. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Don, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm Tamar Durrani, technology reporter with the Globe and Mail, and I'm happy to be moderating this event. Building on what we've heard so far from the company founders, business, and growth leaders, the next panel will take a look at how Canada might foster a stronger ecosystem of innovation for all entrepreneurs. Let's introduce our panelists. Joining me on stage is Irfan Raji, founder and executive chair of Mob Squad, and managing partner of Relay Ventures. And Carol Saab, CEO of the Federation of Canadian Municipalities. Joining us virtually is Francis McGuire, President of the Atlantic Canada Opportunities Agency, and Carol Ann Hilton, CEO and founder of Indigenomics Institute. Thank you everyone for joining us today. So let's get started with some questions. First, I'm just going to ask you all to go around and let's take a quick minute to introduce ourselves, tell us how your role sort of interacts with the topic at hand today, and a little bit about yourself. Irfan, how about you start first? Yeah.
Great. Thanks for having me here, Timur. My name is Irfan Raji. I'm a managing partner at Relay Ventures. At Relay, we incubated a technology talent company that goes around the world and finds the best technology talent that we bring to Canada. That company is called Mob Squad. We hunt globally, we try to bring the best people here, we sponsor their work permits, we employ them, and then we put them on our clients, which are mainly tech scale-ups, mainly in the US as embedded long-term consultants to those firms. Big shortage of tech talent, so there's a business in that. We can pay really well, but still have margin available. And I'm also connected to the Institute for Canadian Citizenship, which is one of the sponsors here today. I've been on that board because I'm passionate about this topic of citizenship and diversity and inclusion, so I've been serving on that board for a few years.
Carol?
Great. Okay. Well, I'm Carol Saab. I'm the CEO of the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, and I also want to thank the Globe and Mail and Century Initiative for this, both this event, but also the broader work around the scorecard and partnership. We've been very pleased at FCM to feed into that work and appreciate that opportunity. A bit about myself, and it's funny. I was thinking while earlier in the earlier panels, while Rania was speaking, how similar my biography is to her. I'm also a Middle Eastern immigrant to Canada, also the first female CEO of our organization, also started at the start of the pandemic, so a true pandemic CEO as well, and to boot happened to also be married to a Welshman, so we have a lot in common as we go forward. A bit about FCM. So we represent cities and communities across the country. So the municipal order of government, we have over 2,000 members. That represents sort of in the high 90s percentage-wise of the population of Canada. We support them with policy work. We are their advocates to other orders of government and to other stakeholders and other sectors. And we also run a suite of programs, capacity building programs, in particular the crown jewel of which is our Green Municipal Fund, which we've now grown to $1.65 billion. It's an endowment fund that really is aimed to sort of spur on innovation in the climate space within municipalities as well. So that's FCM.
How about we get our virtual panelists to tell us a little bit about themselves as well?
Great.
Carol
Francis
Ann.
McGuire.
Yeah, Francis, we'll get started with you.
I've been a bureaucrat for the last before that, retired. I ran the second largest mineral drilling company around the world, operating in 24 countries. So I have a very good sense of what the world's about and where people come from. And the mission of ACO is simple: let the Atlantic economy grow.
Thank you. We'll get Carol Ann as well. Carol, can you hear us?
Yes, thank you. There's a little bit of a lag on the line here. Carol Ann Hilton, I'm the CEO and founder of the Indigenomics Institute. My role in Canada in developing the Indigenomics Institute is to push Canada to start getting ready for the emerging $100 billion Indigenous economy. I'm also the author of Indigenomics, Taking a Seat at the Economic Table, and also the founder of the Global Center of Indigenomics, where we're establishing a global virtual Indigenous marketplace and a 2-year runway on the establishment of a World Indigenous Economic Forum. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, now I'm going to start asking the fun questions, right? Okay, so Irfan, how about you tell us now, how attractive would you say Canada is to start and grow a business at the moment?
I think, as a venture capitalist, I think it's actually a really great environment to start. I mean, there's capital obviously available, but the real win, I think, in Canada is actually our access to talent. If you think about what's happening in many places in the world, there's a fear of the other, we're erecting barriers, we're making it hard to actually have talent mobility. And I think when you build companies, like economies, it's just capital plus labor, right? And so if you have an advantage on labor, which I actually think Canada does right now, I think it's an opportunity for us to continue to see growth, especially as it comes to places in technology where there's a real dearth of talent, right? When you think about cyber, AI, ML, the job vacancy rate in the United States for those jobs is like 50 to 60%. You can narrow that here because of the Global Talent Stream program and our ability to get talent here. And so there is a natural advantage to starting companies here and growing them.
Carol Ann, I'm going to ask you virtually, could you tell us about your goal of supporting the development and visibility of the modern Indigenous economy?
Yeah, absolutely. If we look at 5% of Canada's GDP, to be able to establish the foundation of 100 billion, that's essentially, if we make up 5% of Canada's population, it's important to be able to demonstrate Indigenous economies as constructive, generative economies. And Canada has inherited a perspective of the Indian problem that's gone back through the early policy formation and the language that shaped this country. To be able to adapt towards modern Indigenous economic design, forward thinking, connecting Canada's success to Indigenous economic success is now the new narrative. Understanding that essentially our ability to drive business, drive capital, drive innovation and participation is the story of the emerging $100 billion Indigenous economy. Thank you.
Carol, I'll continue with you a little bit, but tell us a little bit about some of the barriers that Indigenous businesses might be facing at the moment that you think are important to be addressing here.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that it's essential to understand that the growth of the Indigenous economy cannot be externalized singularly to the federal government. The growth of the Indigenous economy cannot exist and grow to its full potential and capacity with federal programs and services. It also cannot exist within the structure and confines of Indian Act economics. To be able to bring forward the structural foundation requires the tools, resources, structures, investment, and leadership towards the 100 billion. Essentially, to be able to identify the capital requirement of the 100 billion, that is the power play that we're looking at.
Carol Ann, I'm going to ask you a little bit about how you can tell us from your perspective, from the Federation's perspective, what you feel towns and cities might be able to do more to attract investors and entrepreneurs and, to foster that ecosystem.
Sure. Okay. Thanks. It's a great question. I mean, a lot of the discussion has been appropriately and necessarily focused on jobs in the context of this conversation. And when I think of unlocking our potential, when I think of how we're going to do this, I think of welcoming cities and communities. And for me, that means cities that have adequate, affordable, the right kind of supply of housing, cities that have efficient transportation options, the right kind of infrastructure, recreational infrastructure, economic and job supports, language supports, so that not only are we attracting immigrants and encouraging them, but supporting them then and encouraging them to stay and retaining immigrants, which I heard an earlier panelist comment about as well. And that's really what municipalities do in large part. They are responsible for a lion's share of that infrastructure, for those services. They really are sort of the front lines of being welcoming, being inclusive, and creating that kind of an environment. And so there's a huge role for municipalities to play. But obviously that sits within an ecosystem, right? And I heard an earlier panelist as well reference the necessity of working across sectors, working across governments. And I think where municipalities can grow, if we're further enabled to grow, both in terms of our sort of fiscal capacity to be able to do this, but also the kinds of dialogue that we should be having as a country, is to really be part of a push towards a more systems level approach to this issue, where we're working across governments, but also across sectors with the private sector, where we each bring our respective levers to bear on this situation, on this emergent opportunity for us to get this as right as possible and as cohesive as possible an approach. And so I think municipalities have a lot to do in each of these spaces, and it requires us to have sort of willing partners in the other orders as well as across the private sector.
You and I were talking a little bit earlier about how there's some differences from city to city, that, and town to town, that are very important. I mean, I've reported all over Canada now at this point, so I kind of understand that there's very big differences in all of them. Tell us a little bit about that. How is it? How do you highlight and go forward with those differences, and sort of make sure that those are highlighted in the best way and addressed?
Yeah, well, and I think it's part of what is the appeal of Canada. We are an incredibly diverse and an amazing country, especially when you look at sort of the different regional attributes that we have as a country, which play out as we were discussing in our membership in real time, but certainly is part of the opportunity here, and I think we sometimes do ourselves a disservice. I appreciate it in terms of scale to really only focus on cities when we're talking about this conversation. It is where most immigrants land. It is where we need to ensure that we're building the right kind of cities and resourcing them appropriately to be able to be as supportive as we can to an immigrant entrepreneur. But I see it also in rural communities. I see it in small towns across these towns. I'll give you one of my favorite examples when I talk about sort of the potential of smaller towns and all of this as well, which is Winkler, Manitoba. They have seen a population growth, of sort of over the past 12 years, 3 to 4% every year. They're growing their population, and they are very intentionally centering their strategy around attracting skilled labor, attracting immigrants. And what they're doing is things in addition to focusing on affordable housing, in addition to setting up the right kind of infrastructure, they're purchasing land for industrial use. They're providing space for business incubation. They're marrying all of these things in a very successful strategy that their community thrives on for them to be able to grow, but also that is then going to benefit sort of their economy and the economy nationally. And you see that playing out successfully in pockets of towns across Canada, and certainly in the biggest cities as well. And I think part of the offer of Canada is that there is something for everyone, and that if we can again have a more cohesive conversation about it, we'd be better able to attract and highlight that to newcomers.
Of course, having reported in Winnipeg, this doesn't surprise me a lot about Winkler. But, let's move a little bit towards the east. And Francis, how about you tell us a little bit about some of the assertive programs that are in place to attract newcomers in eastern Canadian provinces? What are the region's strengths really in that regard?
Well, let me situate immigration first and then our ecosystem second. Immigration in Canada, Atlantic Canada right now, for every 10 people retiring, there's only 7 people to replace them. We need 20,000 people a year for the next 10 years to be able to grow. So that situates things. And in 2019, Atlantic Canada grew more than the Canadian average for 2 reasons, according to the Bank of Canada. 1, automation. 2, immigration. Tells you how important it is. And APEC says, our think tank, that unless we get those 20,000, our growth rate is going to be cut in half. So that positions it. Now, as we try to make sure that we capture the innovative parts of immigration, Atlantic Canada was chosen by a think tank in San Francisco called Startup Genome as one of the 4 best places in the world to start a business. Scaling it's a little bit more difficult, but one of the 4 best. And the reason for that is the connective tissue that we have. And I'll go back to Efren's point of 30 points of service, whether they're in our engineering schools, our incubators, et cetera, who are all tied together. And when Startup Genome mentioned it, we were surprised that one of the key elements was that we had access to the Atlantic Immigration Program, and that it was easier to bring in immigrants into Atlantic Canada, and that scored us very high on an international basis. Now, how's it working? These 30 points are actually a tissue of connectivity. We work very hard to make sure that there's a ladder system within that system, that as we have specialized groups like Cove that does oceans, Bounce that does med tech, and very entry level things like Propel. So the key is to get people and have those points of access. If you don't, you won't succeed. How are we succeeding? If I look at Genesis, which is St. John's, Newfoundland, not actually a big hotbed of immigration, 50% of the founders in our incubation are newcomers. If I look at CDL's Atlantic's current cohort, 45% of the people that are graduating going through it are newcomers. And again, if I look at Propel, this is the entry level, 80% of our people happen to be newcomers. So you need to have open doors where people can meet, et cetera, but then you have to have that progression, that tissue. And we work extremely hard at building that tissue across a region that's rural, that's all over the place, St. John's to Fredericton. So it takes a lot of work that makes that work.
Can I build
Yeah,
on that
for sure.
actually? Because, Francis, you and I have had this conversation because we have an office for Mob Squad in Halifax. And there's something that's happening there that you can't actually point to physically, but it's really important psychographically, which is the average Haligonian knows that the reason their house price is going up is because of immigration. And so they like immigrants. And so when you move people to Halifax, and we have, I think, probably 20 immigrants we've moved there in the last 2 years, they feel welcomed. The media has a role in that, in talking about the importance of immigration and building an economy, about creating jobs, about how that's actually beneficial to those that are already here. And in Halifax, people understand that. And so our staff that are there feel welcomed. They feel like that people want them there. And that travels so that more people that move to Canada are picking Halifax because they hear from their colleagues that this is the environment that's going to be welcoming to them and their family. I think that's really important. I think it's important for all citizens, and I think it's important for the media.
Francis, I'll get you to talk a little bit about retention as well, because having reported in Atlantic, Canada, I know that's an issue as well there, convincing and making sure people stay in those Atlantic provinces. Tell us a little bit about that. How is retention being highlighted?
So you've got to kind of layer that in terms of who the immigrants are, because they're at all levels. They're from people that come to change beds in hotels, to doctors, to nurses, to engineers. On the retention of people going into our ecosystem has been very good. We've had very little leakage, and so that's been great. I think our general retention rate's about 75%, which is up from 60, because of when Efren talks about people understanding that if there isn't somebody that's coming in here to change the sheets in the old old age home, then my grandmother is going to actually suffer. And so even at that level, people right through Atlantic Canada are very, very understanding of the importance. But on the retention of what I would call the higher skilled workers that go into the ecosystem is quite good. If I look at people are just going through our universities, et cetera, it's about 50%. So we've got some work to do there. And we're trying to work at bringing the private sector to say, you've got to grab these people early. You got to give them summer jobs. You got to introduce them. You got to keep care of them. They got to introduce them to other people in the community. Some of our employers are pretty good at it. Still work to be done.
Tell me a little bit about, the impact of the pandemic on all of this, on all these efforts that we're talking about here.
Yeah, it's been really interesting. March 2020, we launched the company in the fall of 2018. No customers, no staff, nothing, just like a PowerPoint deck I had. And by March 2020, we had grown the company into millions of dollars in recurring revenue. And we sort of sat there and we said, now what's going to happen? We were really worried that our customers were all going to have financial distress issues. And so we were going to lose a bunch of clients. What's happened since then is we've quadrupled the business. And the reason is the number one resistance point that we had, which was, do I want to have people that are working on my stuff in different offices? I want to kind of have everybody in New York City. You can't unsee that change. Now we are comfortable having people in different locations. And in fact, from a regulatory perspective, I was on NPR early in the pandemic talking about, if you think about having all of your employees in the United States, private healthcare, where a lot of people don't have access, you actually de-risk your business by putting your offices in multiple regulatory environments. And would you like to have an office during a pandemic for which we don't know the magnitude in a public healthcare environment? So that was really interesting for people to sort of think through that. And the switch went off. And so we are seeing, incredible demand. And one of the winners, there was winners and losers through COVID in terms of industries. Obviously, retail was a loser, hospitality was a loser, technology was a winner. So demand for talent, if you look back a year ago, there were 250,000 open positions for software engineers on LinkedIn in the United States. Today, that number is 550,000. It's been an unbelievable tailwind for us. And it's, to your question on sustainability and making sure that continues and roots, we haven't seen our people, we have offices in Vancouver, Calgary, Toronto, and Halifax. We haven't seen people move between offices. And one of the things that we try to do is we try to get them to build roots, buy a home. And so one of the things that we do as an employer, if you come here as a new citizen or a new worker, you get a new social insurance number. And for the banks, it's a big red flag because that's actually how a lot of fraud happens on these new social insurance numbers. So they give you a credit card for $300. What are you going to do with a credit card for $300? You can't build credit with a credit card for $300, then you can't get a mortgage. And so we actually underwrite all of our staff getting at least $5,000 and assist them, we get them private banking. We do everything we can to make sure they have access to credit so they can buy a home, so they can build roots in the country.
As a tech reporter, you don't have to tell me about the competition. That's the only story we're all reading at this point about the competition. But it's interesting to me that you mentioned U.S. figures there too.
Yeah.
So tell us a little bit about that problem here in Canada versus the U.S. that we're seeing this sort of thing develop now.
Yeah, there's a dearth of high-end talent globally. This is not just a U.S. problem or a Canada problem. But Canada is the only country that has a solution for it, right? So, I mean, AJ did say that governments have never done anything good for anybody ever. I would disagree, because I think that this government, with our immigration targets, with global talent streams, has actually done something that gives Canada a very unique, differentiated, competitive advantage for our economy going forward. Now, it's our job as business people to take advantage of that, and as citizens to encourage our government to do more of it. Like I said earlier, GDP is just capital plus labor. Capital will go anywhere that there is a deal, where there's a return. You can wire it in a second. Labor is sticky. And so if we can use this moment of the fracturing of the world to actually bring the very best labor to Canada, it will absolutely differentiate our GDP growth, our GDP per capita, and it'll give us a long-term competitive advantage. We should double our immigration figures, right? Like, we should absolutely be thinking about how do we use this to our advantage. I'll give you two quick stories. You're a reporter, you like stories. Next Tuesday, we have a gentleman who's currently in Romania. He's Ukrainian. We got him across the border last week. We got him his work permit. He's bringing his wife and his 10-year-old son, because he doesn't want to be in Ukraine right now for obvious reasons. He's moving to Vancouver. 2 weeks from now, Francis, you'll like this, we're taking this guy to Halifax. That was his chosen market. He's in New York. He has a bachelor's degree in computer science. He's got 7 years computer engineering experience. He's got 3 years of US work experience in New York in fintech. He's Ukrainian. His work permit expired in the US. He has to go back to Ukraine or go to Halifax. We're just going to keep doing that.
Yeah.
Since we're talking about government, I'm going to stick to that with Carol. What would you like to see from a government policy level change at this point from the federal municipalities? A big loaded question, but tell us a little bit some of the big things.
We've got 20 minutes, right? I got to answer this question. Well, listen, I'll return to sort of where I started here about the necessity of really, from an attraction and retention perspective, really building strong, vibrant, inclusive cities and communities, which is required for an entrepreneur to thrive and to seed the kind of ecosystem we're all talking about today. And so that requires, and I'll pick up a theme in an earlier question again, that requires steady, long-term, sustained investment in that kind of infrastructure. Very fundamentally, these folks need to have somewhere they can afford to live when they get here. You were talking about Halifax and the Atlantic region. The mayor of Halifax, I have his voice in my ear. It's not by accident that they're one of the most welcoming communities. It's not by accident that folks have an understanding of how much the immigrant community has brought to Halifax. They have very intentionally, they're another great example of where things are going right, centered immigration as part of their economic strategy going forward. And that includes a very intentional focus on the necessary infrastructure around that to support immigrants where they come, because it is, it's nice, and we like to tell the story, and it's true. We live in an incredible country that is fairly welcoming overall, but when you set up a system with a scarcity of resources, there is going to be conflict. And you see this play out in lots of cities across the country where there is not enough recreation space. And so, there is an aversion then to newcomers, folks who are coming and taking in these spaces. There is not enough housing, and there are questions around that. And I think, a really necessary, thoughtful, long-term approach is necessary at a very fundamental when we think about our societal infrastructure at a community level. I think housing, again, I'm dwelling on this, has got to be the baseline for all of this. And so, tomorrow's budget day, hopefully gearing up to see some big moves in that direction on the housing front. And then again, I'll return to this, and it's nice to point to get be asked about pointing the finger at the federal government, but to be fair, I'll point it at all orders of government, my members included, is that we need to do a better job of working together, and we need to do a better job of attacking a problem or an opportunity like we're discussing today from a systems level, right? It is impossible for any one order to be doing things that are going to, in and of themselves, solve the problem. It is impossible for the governments collectively to do it. It is impossible for the private sector alone to do it. And unless we're having these kinds of conversations where we're thinking about what is the conversation the country needs us to have, how can we be bolder about this kind of collaboration, how can we be smarter about building efficient systems across the country, then we're going to continue to miss opportunity, and we're going to sort of, for every 2 steps forward, 1 step back. And I think there is a real potential now to do it. I hear it from our members, mayors across the country want to have this conversation. I see it from various provincial governments and certainly from this federal government, and I hear it increasingly. Goldie and I have had this conversation with the Business Council about there's an appetite. How do we help Main Streets recover? How do we continue to build thriving communities? What does that mean, and how do we each become a piece of solving this problem? That's what it's going to take if we're going to actually unlock our potential as a country. I think it's possible, but I think it takes bolder action from all of us than we've seen yet.
A similar question to Carol Ann virtually. What supports or policy would you say are important for Indigenous-owned businesses to be highlighting here?
Yes, absolutely. I think that we need to be able to support the development of capital structures that enhance the effectiveness of the pace that Indigenous businesses are being created at. It's important to understand that Indigenous entrepreneurs are creating businesses at 5 times the national rate. To understand that and really put that into perspective of Indigenous-led capital, Indigenous design capital, requires us to do things differently. That is an opportunity and not a problem. To be able to understand the ripple effect of Indigenous business growth and development, everybody benefits. When we look at small towns like Osoyoos in BC, very successful Indigenous economy, we see that nation is driving workforce development within the mainstream workforce in a very strategic way. Again, another BC example under treaty, we look at the Ojibwe Nation on Vancouver Island with a major road going in through to Port Renfrew. Looking at a nation that is the substantial landowner in a small town, these are the stories that are shifting and adjusting how we understand Indigenous economic strength. When we realize that these are opportunities for nations to be able to create the space for capital design and increasingly equity ownership in major projects, increased participation in major infrastructure. These are all examples of what these opportunities are and how it looks like when designed properly for Indigenous economic strength. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to ask Francis a question about, what industries or expertise are you specifically sort of targeting for immigration, and why, if you could tell us a little bit about that.
So I'll come back to, we need everybody, the Irish came when they were kind of like illiterate, et cetera. We need people at everything. We have the same problem as Efren though, and I remember seeing Efren slideshows when he first started. But we have 4,000 IT jobs open in New Brunswick right now. How do we fill those? And so certainly whether it's basically the STEM areas that we're trying to focus on a little bit more, but we need people, machine operators. The example I was going to use to make 2 points is groups need a place to meet. So a little town here called Chipman is growing like mad, but it's a tiny town. We have 60 Ukrainians working there. We have 30 more coming in through the system, hopefully getting through all the mess today. But the issue is, where do they meet? And this town's got no facilities. And so all of a sudden we're going to build a community center and say, well, why am I in the economic development building a community center? Because that's what it takes to keep them. And I would raise, because you raised, Carol, housing, absolutely. But the housing crisis is worse, at least in rural Canada, Atlantic Canada, than it is in urban stuff. And the market mechanisms in cities, they're slow, they're hard, all those kind of things, but they eventually will result in better results. those market mechanisms don't work very well in very rural areas. And so this problem of immigration, we're now in the housing business, not because we want to be in rural areas, because we have to be. And that, I think, is what Canada, to Efren's points, these with higher immigration levels, better reception, including what do you do, where do you house these people when they arrive, and giving them a place to congregate, which is really micro stuff. But you got to be at that micro level. And so, Carol, the role of cities, communities, absolutely essential.
I'm going to get you all, and starting with Irfan, to talk a little bit about, because we have these conversations all the time. All of us are aware of them. We talk about them a lot, but I want you to tell me a little bit about what isn't working with immigration and supporting entrepreneurship and what needs to be changed there.
It's a favorite topic of mine. I mean, I'd spend all day, every day thinking about these things and moving these people, so I spend time thinking about how to make it better. I was complimentary to the government earlier. I have one major criticism. Two things that I think we need to do better. The first is, we have 1.8 million people that have applied for permanent residency that are sitting in a lineup trying to contribute to our economy, trying to pay taxes, trying to move here, trying to buy a house, trying to fill one of those 4,000 open jobs. Again, that's 10% of the Canadian workforce is sitting in a lineup, waiting to add 10% to our economy. It's unconscionable that we have a line that long. Think about the economic delta for this country, for our tax base, for our ability to pay for public services, if we could solve that problem. Now, the government, to their credit, recognizes it. They put, I think, another $30 million at that. But, like, there's $1 trillion of value sitting there. Like, what's up with 30 million bucks? Like, this is a big problem. I'm hopeful they solve it tomorrow in the budget, because those people should be processed and be moving here. The second thing that the government can do is think about the closed shops that we have with our professional associations. It's not just about getting people onto our bus of Canada, it's getting them into the right seat. And so at the Institute for Canadian Citizenship, about 4 or 5 years ago, we wrote a report called Closed Shops about how people that are lawyers or doctors or software engineers or engineers, mechanical engineers or otherwise, aren't able to practice their craft here. That's terrible for their dignity, it's terrible for their economic opportunity, and it's terrible for our country. We have to fix those two problems. They're just easy problems to fix with dramatic output for us as a country.
Carol, how about you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure, yeah. Well, I would agree with those points, first of all. And I've already spoken to, the two things that I would have named already of the biggest ones, which is sort of the necessity of investing in community-level infrastructure and also a real shift towards system-level thinking. So to sort of try to add a bit more, because there are a number of things that aren't working, and I'll do this and I'll give a bit of a plug to the work and why we're all here today, really is that we need to have a different looking conversation about the metrics, right? When we're talking about success, what that looks like, what are the indicators of how we're doing, we're talking about a very narrow subset of a much bigger picture. And what the scorecard is starting to help doing, what we need to collectively do in the private sector and government, is have a more thoughtful conversation about the indicators that are relevant to quality of life, that are relevant to the retention rates as Canada. And I think, to the point, we hear it every time on every panel, and I'll say it again, what gets measured gets done. If we don't shift our policy thinking and frame of reference to how are we doing, we talk about, a city like Toronto is doing great things, but also ask a question about how we're doing on childcare. How are we doing on housing? How are we doing on these community centers that we've identified as so critical to this? And so those are increasingly the frame that we all need to be operating within. And I think the initiative that the Century Initiative is working on is going to go a long way to help us get there. The other thing I would identify, and this will come sort of circling all the way back to what Rania Llewellyn said this morning, is that we also need to have a very bold and ambitious conversation about inclusion, anti-racism, about equity in this conversation, because it is one thing to say we're creating the space, we're supporting it with infrastructure, we want to sort of leverage the capacity, but if folks who come here aren't included, don't see themselves reflected in leadership, don't find a path pathway to grow, then we're not going to retain them, right? And I think that this is something that every single person in this room, I suspect, in your position of leadership can be a part of. But we need to continue, I'm grateful to see someone said earlier, and I thought, oh, I wish what you were saying is true, but I think it's true trend-wise. I think we're moving toward a different looking conversation on that. We're not all the way there yet, but I think what isn't working is pretending that that's not the case and hiding behind sort of the image of Canada as a very sort of welcoming place. We are, but we can and need to do a lot better. And that's a conversation that each and every one of us needs to be having if we're gonna take some strides forward in this regard.
Francis, how about you tell us a little bit about that as well? What is and what isn't working?
So I'm a bureaucrat and I don't have any opinions, but all I can say is I think Efren is a very well-spoken, intelligent, and insightful person. Thank you.
Spoken like a true bureaucrat. Carol, tell us a little bit about that.
Carol Ann, sorry?
Yes, you. Sorry. We have two Carols
You have a
today,
Carol
so Carol
and
Ann,
Carolyn.
yes.
Thank you so much. What I suggest is that the consistent measuring of the socioeconomic gap of the Indigenous population isn't working. We need to get over that. Last year, the federal government invested $18 billion into closing the socioeconomic gap. It structures the relationship in terms of deficit instead of Indigenous economic strength. The importance of being able to demonstrate actual measures of Indigenous economic strength requires investing into the tools, into the structures, into the design of the Indigenous economy. Second to that is in an environment of establishing regulatory certainty. To look at examples of a national context, we saw yesterday's announcement of $2 billion investment into the EV value chain of Canada. To look at examples of places like the Ring of Fire requires increased focus on certainty of the Indigenous relationship to ensure that the positive inclusion across the entire decision-making process is supported instead of held up in court. It's time to understand free, prior, and informed consent. It's time to be able to understand that we're in an environment of the uptake and implementation of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. We're in a situation right now, and finally, of saying what is not working. The situation that we're in right now is that the social cart is pulling the economic horse. We need to reverse that, and it's going to take courage of government and private sector and the financial sector to understand and invest into Indigenous economic growth and design. And that's when we will know that it is working. Thank you.
Well, we're going to open up to some floor, onto the floor for some questions. Okay, how about you go first? Can we get a mic?
Okay, a year ago I went to a conference in Norway on immigration and their plan for immigration. I went to Norway to go to a conference on immigration. And at the conference I had a map of Norway and all the existing economies of Norway and their locations and all the up and coming economies and their locations. And what they do is they target immigrants to those economies. And I wonder if that isn't a wise move for Canada. And it fits, then you know where you need, I mean, there are a lot of there's a lot of Canadian municipalities, but there's a priority of where those should go to. And it's just as true of the mid-Canada and the north, Carol Ann, as it is for Carol Saab, that we got, the Northwest Passage is opening shortly. Russia has 4 major ports. Norway has 3. We have Fort Churchill, which is abandoned. This is ridiculous. So I think a plan, what one can do at a larger level, very simply, is target the economies and let municipalities speak up and say what are the economies they need the help in. I don't think it's too difficult a problem.
How about you start first and then I'll get Irfan to talk about it as well?
Yeah, sure. It's an excellent point, right? I think what you're seeing in the Canadian context is this happening in a siloed way, right? Where you have municipalities and others, but I'll speak in my context, municipalities working with immigration consultants to do exactly what you're talking about, to say this is the industry we're trying to build in our town, and we're trying to target this kind of demographic to come here, and this to fill this sort of labor gap that we have and help our population grow. Imagine the potential. I mean, it's such an interesting example you're saying. Sort of like you can picture a visual of a map of Canada if we were to do one comparable. It wouldn't be hard to identify what regions are focusing on which industries. Some might surprise you, but it wouldn't be hard to identify. I think that's exactly the point that is required here. We've got to move out of this sort of siloed-based approach to be able to sort of have a more cohesive conversation as a country about this, and that's got to happen between orders of government. You know, we're dealing with an immigration system and policies that were not sort of set up. It's got to go beyond consultation with municipalities, not set up fundamentally informed by local governments, and that's where the knowledge sits right now.
But the problem in Canada is we're a British colony still, and municipalities and cities have zero power. These are the provinces, let's face it.
Irfan?
You're stuck.
So I think it's a great idea. There's a couple things that I'd comment on. I don't know if this is a pilot or if it's permanent now, but there is a program that allows municipalities to self-elect to say that they want to have immigrants come, and they have to put together a plan to show that it's actually going to work. The good news in Canada is that every province also has their ability through their provincial nominee program, which they can tailor to make that happen. And so in Alberta, where I live, like we worked with the government to actually just put in, I think 8 weeks ago, we launched a tech pilot to try to get 6,000 more tech workers in under the provincial nominee program. So it's incumbent on all of us with these ideas to go to each of our provincial governments, not just the federal government, because all that has to happen is that you got to crack it a little bit. Somebody makes it successful, then everybody will copy it. We just need that. We need that pilot to work.
And part of the map is this map in, we're fly in, fly out.
Yeah, and it's
It's all over the country.
I'll just we'll get to your question as well. We have a few other questions coming in as well. Yes, sorry.
Hi. My name's Emily.
We'll just get you a mic.
I just want to throw the idea out there. One of the things that I find most difficult. Oh, thank you. How's this? I'm not used to that. Is people call me all the time and they're like, I have these, CNC software development skills for manufacturing, or I'm a software developer, or whatever skill set. But I can't get a job in Canada because I put my resume in and it automatically gets turned down because I don't have residency or status in Canada yet. I find it very difficult to connect my clients with the labor market. But there's like a huge demand. So I also have people calling me who are employers saying, I can't get anybody. They'll hire people illegally sometimes. And they're like, how can I keep this person here? Because they're so good. And I really don't want them to leave. And there's really no other option. I mean, under the law right now, they just say you have to send them home for 6 months, and sometimes they can come back. But is there any way that municipalities or business organizations can put together some sort of job board or a central place where companies that are hiring immigrants or who are looking for work, where service providers can go, can get ideas for their clients, can send their clients, and then once you make that connection, the programs are there to get them in most of the time, minus the backlog. But
Irfan, how about we get you?
So I think your problem's exactly right. I think there actually is discrimination in hiring. People don't want to hire people that aren't here. They don't want to hire people that are new to the country. We think that's a problem because we believe that immigrants are stronger employees. We believe if others are going to discriminate, we're going to cherry pick the very best. We started a business because of that problem. Like, that is our business. We hire immigrants and we bring them to Canada because they want to live here. And so it's a real problem. And we created an opportunity out of it. So there are other companies like us that do this. There's fewer than they should be, and soon people will copy what we're doing because they'll see it's successful. And so this will hopefully solve itself. There's an opportunity for all businesses to truly win and have differentiated labor. And I have to say, Timur, I know we're getting to our time, but It's been awesome to be here, to be able to chat with you. And I have to say, I saw Stephen Polos is here, and so like explaining how I think about economics to the former bank governor is definitely on my bucket list. So thank you for letting me tick that off. I can't wait to tell my mother that.
Okay, unfortunately, that's all the time we have for this panel. Thank you so much to the speakers and for all the great questions today. Thank you.
Thank you. Well done.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And now, to close out our afternoon, it is my great pleasure to invite and introduce Stephen Polos, Special Advisor with Osler, Hoskin and Harcourt LLP. Prior to joining Osler, Stephen was the 9th Governor of the Bank of Canada, Canada's central bank. Stephen is also the author of the upcoming book titled The Next Age of Uncertainty: How the World Can Adapt to a Riskier Future. That maps out the powerful economic forces which are shaping our future and the ideas that will allow us to master them. And this morning, Stephen was actually nominated for an award. He is a finalist for the Shaughnessy Cohen Prize for Political Writing for that book. Welcome, Stephen.
Well, thank you very much for that. I got to tell you, it was quite a shocker to wake up this morning and get that email, but it's lovely. Good afternoon, and thanks for the invitation to be here with you today. And thank you for coming. It is really nice to be in front of real people instead of the computer screen in my office at home, which is where I've been for pretty well 2 years. The focus of the conference, of course, is on immigration and the various dimensions of its role in innovation, productivity, economic growth. That's how I look at it from a macro standpoint. And given the global situation we find ourselves in today, while how dire it is, it's certainly a very timely topic. It's one that we need to understand well. I think Canada has pretty well always had an enlightened attitude toward immigration. This is, I think, for a very simple reason, that so many of us are from somewhere else, or our parents were, or our grandparents were. Certainly in my case, my grandparents were. And countries that are maybe less welcoming of immigrants may have fewer immigrants in their population base, so they have a different starting point. But I think it's more likely that countries that are less welcoming are so because of some underlying economic reasoning, such as a shortage of job opportunities. When jobs appear to be under threat due to new technology or globalization perhaps, then domestic workforce is more likely to see immigration as a threat rather than an opportunity. But whatever those underlying reasons, I think there are forces at work that will upend those nationalistic attitudes. And they're going to make many more countries think just as Canada does about immigration. So we might like the idea that more people in the world think like us around immigration. I think the global shift that is coming in those attitudes toward immigration will have potentially serious consequences for Canada. It's going to create heightened competition for those new workers, competition for immigrants that today, frankly, we take for granted and will wish to come here. In other words, there will emerge yet another dimension of competition for future economic prosperity, and that's a competition that, like many others, we could very easily lose. Improving economic prosperity here in Canada requires that we stand up well to international competition in all dimensions. Canada has many competitive advantages: extraordinary endowments of natural resources, particularly water and energy, a world-class entrepreneurial spirit, and a diverse and well-educated workforce supported by one of the world's best education systems. Plenty to brag about. And yet we all know that somehow Canada has been lagging in innovation and productivity growth for a generation. Income per person, slower than almost everybody else that we can compare to. So we are not competing very well out there. We've lagged in business investment and deployment of IT technology. We've lagged in infrastructure, whether it's physical or digital or social. And we've built a reputation for making it kind of difficult to get things done. Now, one thing that we have come to take for granted is our diverse and educated workforce. People really want to immigrate to Canada. We offer a beautiful setting, great schools, good health care, and yeah, like I said, we are welcoming. This has been a key ingredient in our competitiveness, such as it is. But if I'm right, other countries will very soon step up with a stronger effort, a stronger value proposition to attract exactly the same skilled immigrants that we want to come here. And we'll no longer be able to take that edge for granted. Now, the long-term forces that are at play that I want to mention to you, I think they're actually mostly all well known. But some of their implications aren't that well known. The obvious ones: population aging. Here's a bulletin for you. We all get a year older every year. Okay? That's an economist joke. We don't have a lot of them. Perfect. That's the reaction I'm looking for. Rising income inequality. Technological progress. We're very familiar with that. Growing indebtedness. Everybody's familiar with that. And of course, the overriding need to transition to net zero by 2050. Those are 5 really, really big forces. Some of them have been there for ages, but they're actually becoming extremely active right now. I'm not going to go into them in detail, but I want to draw a few implications for you. First, population aging, like I said, very well known and very tranquil for the past 50 years. But now it's the most active that it has been since the 1970s, which is when the reverse happened, right? When the baby boomers, such as me, came to the labor market, and now they're exiting. So this big hump in population growth that lasted for 50 years is now over. And it's easy for you to think that the past 50 years have been typical, but actually the last 50 years have been atypical for us. They're about to become more typical, which is different. It's not the greatest news. Canada is barely replacing its workforce today, and very soon all of our labor force growth will rely on immigration. Now, there are other consequences of this force, such as a continuously moderating trend in global economic growth and continued low or even falling real rates of interest. Those are features of our future. They're not temporary things. The second force, technological progress. It's always there, right? There's always something new coming along. But there's only been 3 big waves, things we call industrial revolutions, okay? And now we face number 4. Number 4 is the digitization of everything. It's the associated AI and those huge advances in biotechnology that are related to those. Now, if we analyze the history of past industrial revolutions, okay, so I'm talking about, the steam engine, electrification, and the computer chip. These are largely forces for good. Okay? They all made us better off, and yet they were hugely disruptive. The first 2 industrial revolutions happened during a period when we were all operating under the gold standard for global international commerce. There were enormous supply shocks, disturbances, and that gave rise to deflation and a depression in both cases. The Victorian Depression in the late 1800s, the Great Depression in the 1930s. The third industrial revolution we managed a lot better, and that suggests that we can manage the fourth even better than that, but that's just something to hope for. The third force, growing income inequality. That's almost always a side effect of an industrial revolution, but over the last 10 years, over 70% of global citizens have fallen behind. They perceive that in where they are, that income inequality has skewed further away from them. That notion of being left out of the prosperity that we've seen, being left behind, that gives rise, every single time we've had an industrial revolution, it gives rise to political polarization, sometimes much worse than that. And today, of course, we see the political ramifications of allowing the income inequality effect of the third industrial revolution, which is plus globalization all happen at the same time, to persist through time. And we saw it politically. Trump, Boris Johnson, if you like, truckers on Parliament Hill. The idea that we're not involved, we're not going for the ride. The fourth force, rising debt, well, it couldn't be more familiar to everybody. But of course, importantly, government debt has exploded globally during the pandemic. We're now at same situation, roughly, that we were in after World War II in terms of government debt. So that's truly a force to be reckoned with, especially given the situation will be much different now than in the 1950s. Well, the fifth force, climate change, you really don't want to talk about that, I'm sure, because it's such a big issue that's in the paper every day. But more specifically, that forced energy transition to net zero, that will be a highly disruptive structural overlay to everything that's been said so far. And so far, it's actually poorly defined. It's just a thing that's going to happen. And there are very many paths from here to 2050. And the more uncertain you are about the path, the less likely are you to grow your business or invest in your business if that's going to affect it. So when you have these forces in motion, bumping into each other, what history shows is that all it takes is a catalyst to generate outsized economic or financial disruptions. Now, a catalyst, historically, could be like a stock market crash, for instance, or the assassination of a political leader. We've had these in the past. It could be a virus from Wuhan, could be, or a rogue political shock like we see today in Ukraine. These are just catalysts that cause the underlying forces to be supremely disrupted. And what we've experienced in the past couple of years illustrates perfectly that we are vulnerable to these dislocations, that we need to be better prepared for bigger risks in the future as these forces grow in magnitude. Each of these 5 forces is growing in magnitude right now. And most of them will grow even stronger if we look 5 to 10 years farther out. Plus, they're going to interact with each other and magnify each other. These vulnerabilities related to them. So specifically, population aging will mean a growing shortage of workers overall. The fourth industrial revolution will cause a major labor market disruption, dislocation of perhaps as much as 15% of the global workforce, estimated by the World Economic Forum. The shortage of skilled workers will be even more acute than the overall shortage. Income inequality will rise even further than we might imagine today in these conditions. So when we think we have a lot of political polarization today, I believe it'll be even more so looking ahead. That's going to make it extremely difficult to develop a consensus around policies that are needed to address these things. Now, because of high debt and the growing fiscal demands of an aging population, governments are going to find themselves with not a lot of fiscal capacity, the ability to address the volatility we're talking about. And low interest rates will mean central banks also won't have a lot of room to maneuver to respond to major disturbances. So the risks and the uncertainties around the path to net zero just puts a major headwind in front of all of this because of uncertainty. Now, these interacting forces are going to make our business environment far more volatile than in the past. And governments, central banks are not going to be able to fix it for us. So my belief is that this rising risk is going to land on our doorsteps, households and companies are going to be left to deal with this themselves. Now, there's a lot of potential implications for this for our future. For the remaining time that I have, I just want to focus on the labor shortages and the occupational dislocation, because that comes directly into the immigration space. Immigration can really help solve these problems. And if we continue to attract more than our share of immigrants from the rest of the world, we can put a floor under our economic growth rate. You know, roughly 400,000 immigrants per year will give us roughly 1% economic growth every year. So it puts a floor under that. Add some productivity growth into that, and we can generate a respectable growth path for our economy. Given the outstanding government debt, you know, whatever it ends up being after tomorrow, you know, that measured as a share of the economy or measured as a share per person, that can be engineered to decline steadily, just as it did after World War II, under those assumptions. But it should be obvious, I think it is, that other countries will be seeing exactly these same issues emerging, and they may come around exactly to the same conclusion. So we will find ourselves competing for those immigrants rather than just opening the door with this big lineup of folks that want to come here. And we need to ensure that we continue to offer a really good value proposition. So for instance, it's exactly the wrong time for us to be nickeling and diming universities. Universities are for sure our biggest and most important channel for new immigration. I think we're actually going to need to boost our funding for universities because that is the channel through which we have a steady flow of very high qualified folks, and they get to test drive Canada and they decide, hey, I'd like to stay here. That's the perfect situation. We need to invest more, not less, in transition programs that help mature immigrants, not ones that go to university, but come here in a mature state of their lives, to qualify for jobs quickly here in Canada. And I heard that in the past panel. I think that's exactly right. You know, from carpenters to brain surgeons, it's not easy, you know, to get into the line of work that you originated in. We need to invest more in simplifying our immigration processes. I heard that too. It's the first time I heard that there's 1.8 million people in the lineup, but I'm not amazed to hear that kind of a number. That's just basic process. We execute poorly. We need to do what we can to promote home construction. Okay, we're hearing a lot of that right now. Possibly we'll hear something more concrete about that tomorrow. The fact is, if you can't have economic growth without immigration, well, you can't have immigration without satisfying the housing demand. Okay, those things kind of link together. And if it's going to cost a small fortune to find a place to live in Canada, that's not a big attractor for immigration. It's likely to deter it. And so that's an important issue for us, a long-term issue, not one that's going to be overnight. We should also be asking ourselves, in addition to these things, why we've been lagging on all the other contributors to economic growth, the ones besides immigration, and we surely have. The fiscal legacy of the pandemic is reason enough to do so. We can't afford to lose even a decimal point of economic growth when you have that much debt to pay down. Okay, so that ratio will fall faster if you can boost, even by a few decimal points, the denominator. But more fundamentally, if we continue to build a reputation for slow economic growth and low productivity, we may become far less attractive as a destination for immigrants, especially those who are entrepreneurial. Now, I know it's easy to blame companies for low levels of investment and therefore low rates of innovation and productivity growth. We see that from time to time. So over the years, I've spent an awful lot of time with companies, one-on-one, and I think we should spend more time looking critically at the impediments to business investment, because many of those impediments are actually subject to government control. So say the biggest impediment to investment in recent years has been uncertainty about the future. And that causes companies to hold back. Well, no kidding. This is real money. There are numerous sources of uncertainty today. We just have to look out the window. Many of them are beyond government control. That's fine. But governments can do a lot to reduce uncertainty in areas where they do have an influence. So first, international trade uncertainty. I mean, this unquestionably held business investment back during the Trump administration. There's absolutely no doubt about that. But many of those very same issues are still relevant today. They have not gone away. So that's the geopolitical tensions in general affect trade-dependent economies like Canada far more than, say, the United States. That's almost indifference. But we need to manage those risks much more proactively, find the solutions to them, and be aggressive in pursuing them. Secondly, the energy transition, which I mentioned before. This is a major source of uncertainty. How many paths can you imagine that will get us to 2050? Well, let's just imagine a couple. You know, one path that sees conventional energy sources simply shut off completely in the quest for zero emissions. Other paths would see those resources continue to play an important role, indeed a central role, in meeting growing global energy demands, but of course complemented by carbon capture technology. After all, the commitment is not to zero. The commitment is to net zero. A lot of people just hear the word zero. It's unfortunate. So conventional energy could be a very important source of higher investment, higher productivity for Canada, but only if the path to net zero, is thoughtfully chosen and made more certain so that companies can make those big long-term investments. So we face an important inflection point on this front, obviously, right at this very moment. Third area, the fourth industrial revolution is clearly a major source of future uncertainty. As I said, the WEF says it could disrupt up to 15% of global jobs. That's millions of people. Now, I expect the business of matching workers to job requirements will become much more difficult for companies in the future. And in Canada, geographic distance and interprovincial differences in certification programs, et cetera, can really hamper this matching process and cause us to operate below our true potential. And today, households bear all the risk of moving across the country. All they receive is a little tax deduction for their moving expenses. Now, I think we could be a little more imaginative there, create some better government-sponsored mechanisms to de-risk labor mobility in Canada, to make it a little easier so that the risk sharing is there, because we all benefit by getting those matches faster. A fourth area of uncertainty relates to infrastructure investment, an essential ingredient to higher productivity growth. And to its credit, the government before this one and this government have set out an ambitious infrastructure program, a financing program, okay, not the same thing. But its deployment has tended to be slow and lumpy, a bit unpredictable, frankly. So we must acknowledge that having an infrastructure financing plan, which we do have, is only the first step in the path to higher productivity for the firms that use the infrastructure. There are many ways to streamline that process too, ranging from permitting to intergovernmental coordination and to providing additional surety capacity for the system, financial capacity. And fifth, red tape, permitting are major impediments to business expansion. Let's get real. Suppose Canada was earning an additional $8 to $10 billion this year by exporting LNG to Europe. Can you imagine that? Well, that would have added 0.5% to Canada's GDP this year, boost government revenue proportionately. But of course, we didn't approve that LNG facility, did we? Now, six, I have to mention this, you know me well enough, I can't have an opportunity like this without mentioning interprovincial regulatory differences, which are estimated to cost Canada literally 4% of GDP every single year. I can't say this often enough, it's free money lying on the sidewalk and no one will bend over to pick it up. Now, fixing those issues would boost the economy, it would boost productivity, and it would boost government revenues besides at zero, let me repeat, zero fiscal cost. Now, I keep hearing that it's politically impossible to do, and I find that incomprehensible. The fact is, we Canadians are sticklers for details. We are process-oriented, we're bureaucratic, we're slow to decide. We're very preoccupied with idealistic definitions of fairness and legalisms. And a lot of other countries can appear far more welcoming economically than when they decide to. Now, I know this sounds like a lot to worry about, maybe even sounds discouraging, and that's not my way, Sonny Steve and all that. So I'd just conclude on what makes me actually hopeful about the future. First of all, more movement of people around the world, that's definitely happening. It's going to happen bigger as we go forward. That will be globally beneficial. Immigrants have historically been more hardworking, more productive, more entrepreneurial than the rest of us. And further, when someone moves from a place with weak social and physical infrastructure to a place that has everything, global productivity rises just from the reshuffling. Accordingly, more movement of people will complement the fourth industrial revolution in creating future prosperity for literally everybody. So even if we fail in restoring our competitiveness here, either on pure economics or in immigration, we will benefit from the rising tide that will raise all boats. But I think the world will be a very volatile place, far more volatile than we've been used to. I call it the next stage of uncertainty, and we're not very well prepared for it. We need to invest in our flexibility and in our resilience, whether it's at the household level, the company level, or indeed the government level going forward. And we need to up our game right now. Thank you very much. Now, I'm not sure if questions are in the cards, are they? Because we do have a couple of minutes, I see. Yeah, okay, so Let's have this fellow down here because he got ripped off the last session. He had his hand up. He had his hand up, and no one said anything to him.
Oh, hello, everyone. My name is Siavash Shakarian. I'm an engineer/lawyer, and I'm an immigrant. I now practice business immigration. I bring entrepreneurs to this country, but today I'm here as an advocate for better immigration policy. And I agree with you. I agree with Irfan. We're good. We're definitely good. We're probably the best in the world, but we can do better. Mm-hmm. And in the interest of doing better, I ask you, how much policy, because there is policy, there is good intention. We have perfect intentions, but there is execution. Right, so is the problem just this government, or there's something in the policy that we need to fix? I'll give you an example. A few months back, we were scared because it was COVID, and we thought we're not going to hit the numbers. Yeah. So our immigration system is very selective. Some say it's discriminatory, right? So we lowered the bar so much that people that never thought that can become Canadian permanent residents became Canadian permanent residents, but now in this startup visa program. We have 6,000, we're not touching them, and they can have multi-billion-dollar ideas like the one that Irfan has.
Right.
So what are we doing wrong? Do you think this government is good, but do you not think that it's time for a better government, or?
Well, I don't know if I should get in an argument with this guy or not, because we always say, lawyers, they know everything. But a lawyer and an engineer at the same time, they know everything with precision, right? Anyway, so I'll just go with this. I mean, I do think it's mostly it's not a matter of attitude. I think it's primarily execution, which is systems. And I was alluding to, we've got protocols and things, layers of decision making that have to go through. We've designed systems that are very heavy, they're paper laden, they're bureaucratic, et cetera. They've been designed with the right intentions, but one of the intentions is not efficiency. That's I think. I mean, I don't know it well enough to make that as my final word on it, but that's my impression. I don't think it's a matter of policy or intention or willingness. So that just means, like in the previous thing, he said, wow, they invested $30 million and we got this, $1 trillion yield. Well, that's a pretty low investment. If there's one department maybe that needs expansion, more resources, immigration would be it. And that would help to pay for everything else that we do, right? So I guess it sounds to me like we're on the same page. I don't have anything to.
They have the money, 38% they didn't use.
Yeah, no, I understand that. So that's what I mean by execution, right? The same thing, you announce stuff and the money doesn't get used. It's just it didn't get out the door or through the system, or somebody was asked to study something and they took a long time to study it, or if they did, they kicked it upstairs and they asked for something more. How does it take that many years to choose a fighter jet? Those things, they just seem to take more time than they should. I'm a former quasi-bureaucrat. I mean, I've seen the system from the inside. There's care and there's due diligence and all this. It's not the sort of thing you want to throw it all away. So you need to think about it better with a more efficient kind of system. You can't just throw money at it and hope it goes away. That's what that says. Got something else? Are we got another question? One more question, especially if it's a really good one, like that. That was a good one. Yeah, well, that's right. Although there really is 2 mics that cuts the distance in half. There we go.
Thank you, Stephen, for that great presentation. My name is Ruba. I'm from immigration.
And this woman deserves a raise and more resources. Did I forget to mention that? Okay.
No, actually, my question to you is in terms of net zero emissions.
Okay.
I'm thinking about the green economy and the growth that's happening or going to happen in that area. Are employers ready in terms of transition to the green economy? I know you mentioned there's a lot of uncertainty, but from immigration side, when it comes to selection, should we start looking for those skills of people who have skills in clean tech, for example?
Well, I would say by all means, sure. What I think is going on is the companies are on their own agenda. They're being forced there by their investors, by their employees, by their customers. And a lot of this transition to 2050 would happen all by itself without a master plan. provided that we at least had clarity that you weren't going to lose all the money you invested on your way there because some arbitrary change in the rules happened without foreknowledge. So everybody's looking for the same types of resources, people with experience, and of course at the corporate level, board members that have that experience. There's a lot of demand throughout the strata. So of course that's worth prioritizing, but not at the expense of, let's say, people with trades skills or construction workers where the shortages are absolutely binding. You know, I mean, that we can't execute the infrastructure program because there aren't enough workers to do that. I was talking to somebody this week who said, "Wow, if a bunch of folks from Ukraine want to land here, we'll hire them. You know, if they've got even some exposure to the trades." So I think that there's a lot of willingness there across the spectrum. But I certainly am not going to disagree with you. We need more aggressive work in that direction, and it will be a major source of growth for us. I agree with that completely. So it's not as though we have to rely only on our traditional, but I think we can also do both. We're going to stop. Thank you for being here. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Stephen, and what a great way to close out our event today. That concludes our program, but we hope you can stay with us for some networking. I would like to thank all of you for coming today and everyone in the virtual audience attending. I would also like to thank, on behalf of the Globe and Mail, Century Initiative for supporting today's event. Thank you, everyone.